Through the use of Lightroom's clarity, texture, and dehaze sliders, we have the power to create incredible atmosphere in our photographs. We just need to figure out smart ways of incorporating them that renders a realistic result. In this video today, I'm going to show you the techniques I have developed to add atmosphere, potentially increasing the emotional connection to my photographs. So to demonstrate how I add atmosphere to my images, I'm going to use this image of this wild dog. I like the backlighting that is captured here, but I think the color of the image is very drab and it's lacking a little bit of life and a little bit of that atmosphere. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to probably go back to using the camera profile that was the flat profile. There's a lot of highlights in the top of the head here and on the side that I just want to bring back. Sometimes the Adobe standard profile adds a little bit too much contrast, so I'm going to use the camera flat. So the first thing I'm going to work on is the white balance. I think the white balance is pretty good as it is. Let me just tweak it a little bit. And then I'm going to drop down the exposure and I'm going to soften the shadows. So just drop it down a little bit like that. And then raise up the blacks to bring some of that exposure back. And then I'm going to use the white slider to bring back some contrast. Just keep in mind when using this white slider, if you adjust contrast this way, is just to watch those very bright areas so they don't become blown out. You can hold down the Alt button just to make sure you're not blowing anything out. As you can see there, those areas are blown out and lack detail. I'm just going to keep it in check there a little bit. And to adjust the shadows, and then maybe drop down the highlights in those bright areas. So before we start, I want to just bring down these bright areas just to balance them a little bit. So I'm going to go into a radial gradient just for this little section here. Just going to drop down the exposure just a bit, maybe some of those highlights as well. And then also on that area there, so I'm going to create another radial gradient just over that little bright section there. These are very subtle changes, but it's just a nice way to balance the exposure. And that's looking pretty good. I want to maybe increase the exposure on the face a little bit just to bring that more into the eye of the viewer. Very subtle little adjustment there. And I might add some clarity just to increase the details on the face there. Next thing I'll do is I will add some clarity to the image overall, not too much, just a little bit. And what I'm going to do further for this image, I want to adjust a lot of these colors. So I'm going to boost the colors, I'm going to bring up the vibrance and the saturation just a bit there. So you can see that's a little bit too much, but I'm going to adjust the colors a little bit later on. In the tone curve, I'm going to increase the lights a little bit just to bring back a bit more of those highlights and bring down the darks just a touch. I think maybe I'm going to go back to the whites, just to bring the whites down. It's getting a little bit bright on top of the head there. I don't want to darken that area because that's where the light is hitting. So I'm just going to make sure that doesn't get blown out. Okay, so in the HSL tab here, I'm going to adjust a lot of the colors. But before we do that, I'm going to add what I call a distant black adjustment. What that means is I'm going to raise the blacks of the background. This background is nicely diffused and it was quite far behind the wild dog. And I feel to increase atmosphere, I like to have very dark blacks in the very close foreground and then in the distance raise the blacks. Because the further you look back in a scene, the blacks seem to become a little bit more hazy. So we're going to replicate that effect. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select my subject. And now I'm going to invert that selection because I want to adjust the background. And then I'm going to raise up this blacks. And possibly a bit of negative dehaze. That's also going to soften that background a little bit for me. I'm noticing a bit of a problem here where the selection is causing a little bit of a line there. So I'm just going to add to the selection and sort of bleed the effect over onto the back of the wild dog a bit, just to get rid of that line there. You can see that's worked quite nicely. So this is a before and an after, just on that sort of distant black adjustments. You can see we've softened that background quite nicely. What I want to do next is I want to darken the bottom of the background. So I'm going to duplicate this mask to create another mask of the background. So I'm just going to click here and say duplicate mask 4. I'm going to reset the settings. Just click reset there because I don't want to make the same adjustment. And now I want to intersect that background mask with a linear gradient. I'm going to click and drag like this. I just want to darken just a little bit of that bottom piece of the background there. A little bit like that. I might cool it down just a touch. And essentially what I want to do with the background is I want to darken the bottom, and just now I'm going to add a highlight sort of bleed on the top here. So that's going to create some nice atmosphere in the background. But before we get there, let's work on the colors in the HSL panel. I'm going to adjust the hues of this green mainly, and a bit of the oranges to bring back a nice warm, softer color there. You can see it's almost going from summer to winter. And I like that brown color. It just feels a little bit more moody to me. Something like that. And I might adjust the saturation here just to make that background a little bit more drab. I think that's looking pretty good. So the next thing now is I want to add some color grading. I want to make the shadows a little bit more blue, and I want to add some nice warm color to the highlights. So if you've seen my tutorials before, I'm going to increase the blue appearance in the shadows, probably using around about 225 on the hue there, and about 24 on the saturation. That's looking nice. And then the highlights, probably add in some nice warm color there. That's looking a little bit too much, but I'm going to adjust the blending and balance sliders now. So the blending slider blends all of these colors together depending on what value you choose. So a value of 100 on the blending blends the highlights and the shadows together, and a value of 0 keeps them apart. So I'm going to add some blending there. And the balance then will either orientate the image more towards a shadow or a highlight. So you can see a balance of 100 is basically telling this highlight color grading tool here to add to most of the image, because with this balance now we've indicated that most of the image is a highlight. And if you go back to minus 100, you're indicating that the image is more of a shadow. So I'm just tweaking these sliders. It's nice to experiment with these and probably look at around about something like that. On the color grading, maybe add some more highlight color here. Maybe a bit less on the blue. Just want it to be nice and subtle. Adding that color contrast really helps the image stand out. Just want to increase the warmth a little bit. If you're enjoying the video so far, please hit the like button below and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. So the next adjustments, I want to zoom in onto these eyes, and I want to brighten the area, those bright areas there. So I'm just going to go into the brush, make the selection a bit smaller, just brush a broad stroke onto there, and then on the white slider, increase the whites. So what that is going to do, it's going to give the eyes a lot of clarity. So you can see before, that bright area is quite dull, but just by adding that adjustment, it brings a lot of life back to those eyes. Then the next thing I want to do is I'm going to create a, you could call it a softening vignette around the image. So I'm going to create a radial gradient over the face of the animal, and then I'm going to invert that gradient to select the outside. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some negative clarity, not a lot, you don't want to overdo it, and a little bit of negative texture, and maybe a touch of negative dehaze, just to add a little bit more atmosphere around the outside. So that's just a subtle way of showing more attention to the face by softening the outside. And what I might do is I might just darken that area a little bit there. Now I'm going to create one of my favorite effects. We are going to add a nice highlight glow in the back. We're going to create a sense of sunlight coming from the top. So what I will do now is I'm going to select subject, and I'm just going to clean up the subject a little bit here. I can see a few issues, especially on the back here like we had earlier. So I'm just going to hit subtract, brush. It's going to bleed that background a bit there. I'm going to soften some of this edging here, and then zoom into 100%, and just clean up some of this fur on the side, because I know that with this effect that I want to do, I need a perfect selection. So that's looking pretty good. And now what I want to do is I want to create an inverted mask of this. So what I'm going to do is right click on mask 7 here and say invert mask. And then I'm going to intersect that with a radial gradient, and I'm going to place that over the top of the image. Just going to zoom out here, drag a nice big radial gradient over the top. And essentially what I'm going to do now is increase the exposure and add some positive blacks just to soften those shadows a bit, and then also add some negative dehaze, and then potentially warm up that light as well. Something looking like that. Just place that a little bit there. You don't want to go overboard and drag it all the way down. You just want to add a subtle hint of light coming from the top there. So that is the mask 7. So that is the highlights bleed from the top. And I think this image is getting close to being finished. I just want to adjust some of these colors a bit, especially on the tint and the white balance. Maybe darken this a little bit more. Just add some final tweaks to the image, making sure not to blow those highlights above the head. And then one of the last things I want to do is add a vignette. You can either use this effects panel here, or what I'd prefer to do is use a radial gradient. Click and drag over the image. Invert that because we want to affect the background. But now I don't want to darken the area that we've just brightened up. So I'm going to subtract a linear gradient from this selection. It's going to zoom out. I don't want to darken the top of the image there. So I'm going to remove that from the vignette. Just zoom in, darken that down a bit there. Find the image has got a little bit of purple in it. I'm just going to desaturate that. I'm not a fan of purple or too much magenta on these warm images. And then maybe just come into the tone curve just to darken down a bit. Maybe add a slightly faded black look here. Bring back some highlights. And something like that. If you're interested in secrets to moody wildlife photography in Lightroom, check out this video next.